The Mojave Desert was not an especially welcoming sight for a town. But that's where Las Vegas was born. By 1920, the town had survived for 15 years. From the beginning, Las Vegas was a railroad town, built for and relying on the powerful Iron Horse. But in the early 1920s, Las Vegans discovered another connection to the world: the automobile. On a road called the Arrowhead Trail, people could now drive all the way to Los Angeles. Las Vegas was still small, but it was on the move. As the 20s advanced, its citizens would bring home more and more of the marvelous tools of the modern world.
It was radios, it was long-distance telephone calls, it was daily air mails, and it was talkies. Every day you would read the newspaper and something new was going on.
The 20s would be a decade of strife, of busted bootleggers and a contentious strike. But it was also a time of boundless dreams, a decade that reinvented Las Vegas. The 20s pointed the way toward a future that would be big, bold, and almost unbelievable. In 1920, Las Vegas was a city of just over 2,300 people. Ed Von Tobel Jr. recalled growing up here.
People used to walk down to the railroad depot to see that big old steam engine come in.
Las Vegas in the 1920s still was a small town. Everybody knew each other.
Life in the desert in the early 20s was not for everyone. In summers, there was no real relief from the heat.
There was no air conditioning, so to live here in the summer, you had to be a trooper.
Many homes lacked indoor plumbing.
Living conditions in Las Vegas were not up to standards for everybody. Some of the houses were more like shacks and tents.
In the early 20s, farmers and ranchers still drove into town to sell their goods. Dean Pulsiver.
I used to come to Vegas with my father when I was 8, 10 years old. We used to bring down a wagon load of chickens. We'd bring them to Las Vegas, and we'd park on Fremont Street. And I remember Fremont Street. There was nothing on Fremont Street. It was all dirt, not a paved road anywhere.
Another young man came in with milk from the family dairy farm. Lamar Formaster.
I was peddling milk in an old Model T Ford, and it had rained pretty good the night before, and I got stuck right in front of what's now the Golden Nugget. My dad had to come from the old ranch with a team of horses, pull the Model T Ford out of the mud so I can go on delivering the rest of the milk.
There was some farming. There was the kind of thing that any town of several thousand people would need. Banks and stores and barbers. Everybody's hair grows, right? Like that kind of thing.
But it was a stable community, but it was a town that didn't really have a future. It was looking to be something beyond what it was.
In 1920, Las Vegas was not only small, it was also young, just 15 years old. Back in the first years of the 20th century, the area's natural springs had drawn the interest of a tycoon named William A. Clark. His railroad needed a place between Salt Lake City and Los Angeles where trains could stop for water and repairs. The railroad bought a chunk of land. In May 1905, a large crowd stood in the blistering sun to buy small plots of it at auction. For many, this was the birth of Las Vegas.
With Las Vegas, everything focused on two things. It was always water, and it was always transportation. The city was laid out in terms of the railroad. The railroad still controlled the water, so it still controlled how the city was growing.
By 1920, the people of Las Vegas were proud of their accomplishments. But there was a lot more to do.
You're getting more concern about the kinds of sanitation, the kinds of sanitary conditions that a larger town needs. There are people who are still going around with the idea we can expand, we can develop, we can do new things with this community.
The thing we have to remember about Las Vegas is it always thought of itself as a community. This was a town that was going to be a city. This was a town that was going to continue to exist. It wasn't a one-shot deal. This was a town that was going to be a business center for the area, even though it was out in the middle of the desert.
From the beginning, the Desert Way station for the railroad had served another function. It had always been a place where a man could get a drink. Before Prohibition, Las Vegas had 12 bars, some inside hotels.
Of course, in Las Vegas, there was always liquor available, and in particular in this area called Block 16. Now, when they were laying out the town site, they set aside two blocks, Block 16 and Block 17. And that was the red light district, and that was where the sawdust joints were for the gambling and for drinking.
In America at large, the Volstead Act of 1920 kicked off the wild decade called the Roaring Twenties. The act outlawed the production, transportation, and sale of alcohol.
Las Vegas was in the forefront of Prohibition. It voted for Prohibition before it went into effect across the United States.
In Nevada, we got rid of alcohol before national prohibition. Now, does that mean we closed all the bars here? No. It means we took down all the signs. Our idea of prohibition was don't put up any signs that advertise what kind of beer you have.
Prohibition means that when you're very visible on Fremont Street, you kind of have to pull in your horns, dial it back. Sam Gay is the legendary sheriff at Clark County when Prohibition comes in.
Many of the bootleggers distilled their hooch outside of town, under Sam Gay's jurisdiction. In theory.
He didn't see any reason to go after bootleggers. Drink whatever you want to drink. I don't care.
Sam Gay's attitude is, if you're not bothering people, I'm not bothering you. So it's okay.
Prohibition would be a wild ride for some in Las Vegas, but for many in the city, the 20s would be an emotional roller coaster for a very different reason. There was now talk of a dam on the mighty Colorado. The Colorado River was not America's longest or widest river, but it captured the human imagination because it was a river of incredible energy, beauty, and violence.
The Colorado River was very wild, and you couldn't depend on it staying in one place for very long. Floods came down in the winter, it would change its bank, it would go here, it would go there, and it got away from them during a big flood in 1905, and the Colorado River changed its course and flowed right through the Imperial Valley into the Salton Sink and became the Salton Sea, which is still there today. The Imperial Valley at the very southern end of California, it was producing meat, cattle, pigs, chickens. It became a really important breadbasket for the country.
There had been talk of building a dam on the Colorado going back into the mid-19th century. People wanted to control it. The League of the Southwest is formed, and these are the 7 states that share the Colorado.
The League of the Southwest, they began gathering representatives from all of the 7 states of the Colorado River Basin, and that included a man from Las Vegas named Charles Pemberton Squires, Pop Squires.
C.P. Squires is one of the developers and one of the promoters of Las Vegas. He came here in 1905.
In the early days of Las Vegas, Squires and his partners helped finance a tent hotel, a bank, a real estate firm, and the first electric power and telephone companies in Las Vegas. He invested in lumber and mining, too.
In 1908, he bought the Las Vegas Age newspaper. He really was not a newspaper man. He was a promoter of Las Vegas.
C.P. Squires fervently believed that the destiny of Las Vegas was linked with one very large object. C.P. Squires.
I knew there was one thing above all that Nevada, especially Las Vegas, needed. That was a dam in the Colorado River.
Florence Boyer.
My father, C.P. Squires, was an early, untiring advocate of the dam. It seemed to ensure a prosperous future for his beloved Las Vegas. I'm sure no single person devoted more time and effort towards that project.
He was one of the greatest boosters, so he got involved with the League of the Southwest.
The League lobbied Congress, and in 1920, the government funded an engineering study of the Colorado. That April, Walker Young of the Federal Bureau of Reclamation sent out geologist Homer Hamlin.
Homer reported that there were dam sites in Boulder Canyon that would meet the requirements. But if the dam sites in Boulder Canyon were not suitable, there was another site 20 miles downstream in Black Canyon.
So Walker Young led a 58-person expedition to Boulder Canyon to compile a detailed engineering study. The job would take 2 years. All the while, enthusiasm for a dam began bubbling up in southern Nevada.
Las Vegas boosters said, well, that's going to bring an enormous amount of business into town.
Helen J. Stewart was one of those boosters. A Las Vegas pioneer, Helen arrived in Nevada at 19 in 1873. Her husband was killed in a gunfight, but she stayed in their remote ranch in the Las Vegas Valley and raised her 5 children without him. In 1902, she sold land to the railroad to create the new town. Now, in 1920, she wrote eloquently of the city's future.
Wait until they have the Colorado River harnessed to a big dam, when the great waters of the Colorado are controlled by man's will and ingenuity. We can get the big pumps going and pump water over this wonderfully prolific valley land.
By the next spring, Helen Stewart, like many others, was convinced. Yes, the dam was coming soon.
The optimism was that this was going to happen and Las Vegas was going to profit from it.
Las Vegas is feeling the spur. People are ready to embark in any sort of development enterprise promising profit. This influx includes small farmers, land seekers, prospectors, geologists, engineers, representatives of capital. It is the beginning of a movement with Las Vegas as its natural point of concentration. In March of the same year, a distinguished American visited Las Vegas, Herbert Hoover. Hoover was then Secretary of Commerce. 6 years later, he would be elected President of the United States. He had become popular for having engineered the feeding of starving people in Europe during World War I. Now, he took on an impossible job. As chairman of the Colorado River Commission, he would have to get 7 western states to agree on a dam, then form a 7-state compact. But there had never been a compact among so many states. And Arizona wanted no part of a dam at all.
Everybody agreed except Arizona, and they fought it and fought it.
After 4 days, the first meeting of the commission broke down with no agreement. Even so, in that spring of 1922, U.S. Congressman Phil Swing of California introduced a bill to fund a Boulder Canyon dam.
Las Vegas was sending people like Pop Squires to Washington to lobby for it.
Squires' newspaper says Boulder Canyon Dam a certainty. But no, it was not a certainty. Swing's bill met tremendous opposition. Private utility companies fought tooth and nail against any attempt to allow the government to create electric power.
And then the Boulder Canyon Project Act was introduced in Congress and lost and lost. People in Las Vegas would get their hopes up, it's gonna happen, and it didn't happen.
There was a hope. Now, hope today tends to be in the next 5 or 6 minutes. In those days, hope could spread over several months and a couple of years and still have that hope. And that's what they had through most of the 1920s, hope.
Hope was always about the future. And in the early 1920s, many of the modern marvels Las Vegans were hoping for were beginning to show up.
This was a town where cars were coming in.
The federal government was starting to build a highway from Los Angeles all the way to Salt Lake City. It was a highway, but it was the Arrowhead Trail, literally because they followed Native American old routes from the 1800s. There were roads, dusty roads with big grooves in them, and you could drive a car between the two points. But they were terrible.
This was not an area that was easy to use automobiles, but they were coming in. Everybody wanted an automobile.
Then in May 1920, a flying machine landed on a patch of naked dirt in Las Vegas. It was as if the future had dropped in on the tiny city in the desert.
What's interesting is we didn't stop. This wasn't just a one shot. Oh, wow, a plane stopped here. Within a few months, on Thanksgiving Day 1920, we opened an airport here.
Another amazing new machine arrived in 1922. The Majestic Theater began to offer a brand new kind of entertainment: radio shows.
Broadcasting from our Senate Theater studio.
The first ones were for an audience. The movie theater would set up a radiophone, as it's called, and the community would hear sports. Or in one case, they heard Herbert Hoover talking about the potential of the dam. It was almost like the internet today, what impact it had on the community.
Columbia double disc record.
Within a couple of years, the radios had gotten smaller and gotten cheaper, and so pretty soon there were many households in Las Vegas that had radios.
The modern age was making an appearance in Las Vegas, but it was the engine of the 19th century, the railroad, that ran the city. It always had.
The railroad that founded Las Vegas was the venture of William A. Clark and his family. The Union Pacific, through a series of accommodations, wound up owning half of it and kind of bankrolling half of it. It was pretty clear that the animating force behind the Salt Lake route was Clark and Clark's interests. He was a tycoon of substantial proportions, and by the early 1920s, he was toward the end of his life.
Senator Clark decided that he was done with the railroad business, and in 1921, he sold it to the Union Pacific. And they ran things a little stricter, a little tighter, a little more businesslike, and immediately laid off between 60 and 100 people in Las Vegas.
That's the shift from kind of a family, tycoon, distant, relative kind of thing to this sort of modern managerial capitalism kind of thing.
The relationship between the railroad and its city soon suffered a crippling blow. It would be called the Strike of 1922. The trouble had been brewing for years. During the First World War, the federal government took control of all railroads and paid the workers a reasonable wage. But after the war, railroad operators were back in control, and wages for the workers were cut. Once in 1921, then again in June 1922.
The Harding administration was very aggressively pro-business. They announced, I think, 12% cut in wages for shop workers. And this was across the board, right? Not just in Las Vegas, but elsewhere.
On July 1st, unions fired back. All over the country, unions of railroad repairmen went on strike. About 400,000 workers, the largest work stoppage the railroads had seen for 28 years.
In Las Vegas, unionized labor was big. So there was a real measure of solidarity.
The contest is on. At the stroke of 10 o'clock this morning, a short blast of the shop whistle announced that all efforts to avoid the strike had been in vain. The men of the Union Pacific here walked out quietly and soberly. Las Vegas age, July 1st, 1922.
The workers in the shops laid down their tools and walked out. All of the boilermakers, all of the carmen, all of the blacksmiths. And that's a pretty dramatic thing when you think about it, right?
Clarence Ray.
Nobody was making any money. One day a guy came down and asked, would you be interested in working? All of us said yes. He said, you gotta go to Las Vegas. You make about $5 a day, which is real good pay in 1922. So we left for Las Vegas on the Union Pacific Railroad. But when we got here, we found out there was a strike. The man didn't tell us he was looking for strikebreakers. So I slipped out, caught a bus back to Los Angeles.
The railroad imported strikebreakers. They brought these folks from out of town. And the idea was that they would live within the walls of the railroad stockade. The railroad actually had a great big fence, like a fort. The first couple of weeks were very optimistic. The strike seemed to be going well.
The city was incredibly behind the strike. Even Sheriff Sam Gay, he hired a few of the strikers as deputies to keep the peace, but really that was saying that he was in support of the strike.
In other parts of the country, violence broke out. Company guards fired at striking workers. At least 10 people died.
In early August, tensions get ratcheted up somewhat.
One group of women beat up a wife of a strikebreaker. It was a wild moment.
18 strikers were arrested for trying to stop strikebreakers from working.
It becomes a very ugly situation in Las Vegas.
Unions of train drivers joined the repairman strike.
The strikebreakers living inside that fence were running out of food. They started to have dwindling supplies. The strikers didn't know this. This was only revealed afterwards in the telegrams, the private telegrams of the railroad.
On August 8th, Union Pacific lawyer Frank McNamee Sr. wrote Governor Emmett Boyle. Frank McNamee.
A body of strikers numbering from 50 to 100 stopped our train number 20 at the West Yards at Las Vegas and forcibly and brutally beat up and dragged from the train 5 men employed by the railroad. On the 3rd day of August, our trainmaster Zentmeyer was tarred and feathered. Unless some steps are taken, immediately there is a danger of a calamity befalling Las Vegas in the way of loss of life.
The governor of the state of Nevada has to come down to Las Vegas in an effort to quiet the strike.
The town is simmering. It seems like a moment when something's really going to happen.
But one night, a striker made a big mistake. He leveled a gun at the governor himself. Governor Boyle pulled out a revolver and disarmed the striker. Then he called in the state police to restore order.
So that really is the moment where the tide shifts. You know, they had gotten awfully close. The strikers had the strikebreakers short on supplies, the railroad officials panicking. The government was not necessarily interested in intervening.
The strike went quickly downhill.
The Union Pacific made a couple of good moves. They just said, anyone who wants to work will get a pay raise. By the end of 1922, if you were going to work for the railroad, you would have probably gone back to work. Many people did.
The strike was over, but the bitterness was not. The railroad soon made a critical decision. They would keep the Las Vegas repair shops open, but make the operation much smaller.
They took a lot of jobs out of Las Vegas. They moved them to Caliente.
The drop in the number of machinists in Las Vegas is precipitous.
Those paychecks of those several hundred workers stopped. So it was an awkward time in Las Vegas.
They were trying to hurt the community.
The purpose for the Union Pacific's decision was never certain.
Now, the UP does say this is not really punishment, and to prove their general decency, they give the community a new tennis court to make up for it.
There's a difference between being a railroad town and being a town with a railroad. And I think after the strike, that's when you see that change.
Even as the strike was winding down, engineer Walker Young was delivering his final report about the intended dam site on the Colorado. None of the Boulder Canyon sites would work, but Walker Young had another idea.
We thought of Homer Hamlin's suggestion of a dam site about 20 miles below Boulder. We three got in a boat and we sized Black Canyon up. When we were there, we discovered a stake that was set by Homer several years before.
Black Canyon was more accessible and more solid than Boulder Canyon. The canyon could bear a heavier load. And Black Canyon had one other crucial advantage.
I discovered it was possible to actually build a railroad from Las Vegas to the top of the Black Canyon dam site. We could get the resources, millions of tons of materials, down to that dam site on a standard gauge railroad. As I've said many times, the Lord left that dam site there. It was only up to man to discover it and to use it.
In late 1922, Herbert Hoover and the Colorado River Commission met again.
Pop Squires and several other boosters from Las Vegas went to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where these representatives from the 7 states were meeting. Okay, we're going to build a dam on the Colorado River. Pop Squires says, yeah, great, this is going to be great for Las Vegas and LA and the Imperial Valley and everybody else. But how are we going to divide the waters?
California is going to get most of it because it's California and it's big and it's growing and it's always big and growing and developing. Nevada gets 300,000 of those 7.5 million acre feet.
But for C.P. Squires, even this amount was a triumph.
It was my father who insisted that in the distribution of water, Nevada be allowed 300,000 acre feet. Nobody at that time thought we'd have much use for it, but he insisted that it be put into the compact.
In November 1922, 6 states signed the Colorado River Compact.
When you look at the 20s in Las Vegas, like, okay, we've got aviation coming in, woohoo! We've got the Arrowhead Trail Highway coming in and that getting improved, woohoo! We've got the strike against the UP, not so good. The move of all the jobs out of the rail yard, not so good. Then we get the Colorado River Compact. Oh, that's a good one, because the Colorado River Compact means that something is going to finally happen with the river. We're going to finally probably get a dam built.
Or would they? Congress was not yet convinced. In the spring of 1923, 40 congressmen came to Nevada. Merle Emery was enlisted to ferry the visitors up and down the river.
You talk about Las Vegas entrepreneurs back in the day, and Merle Emery was probably one of the most colorful and interesting of them. He made his living river running.
Merle Emery.
We were real busy at that time because we were hauling governors and senators and congressmen till they were running out of our ears.
And it didn't make any difference to him who they were. They were just someone that got in the boat. Don't rock it. Don't fall overboard. I won't save you. And he took them up and down the river.
C.P. Squires soon took the Las Vegas sales pitch to an even higher authority.
One morning in Washington, I was given an interview with President Calvin Coolidge. He was very pleasant and polite and allowed me to tell the whole story. I was sure that I had him completely convinced. I said, "Now, Mr. President, isn't that a wonderful project?" expecting him to say, "Why, yes, and I favor it." But I could get no word from him as to whether he would approve the bill or not.
Legislation for a dam still continued to languish in Congress. Helen Stewart and the rest of Las Vegas were still waiting.
Our Boulder Canyon Dam appropriation is delayed until next December meeting of Congress. The wise ones will hold on and wait with patience and make money. Oh, let it come soon.
Very little seemed to be happening in Washington, but the same was not true of the small city in the Mojave Desert. In the mid-20s, the Las Vegas Review described the state of the city and its future. Las Vegas has 5 churches, 2 large banks, 2 newspapers, electric lighting and telephone systems, a good public library, and all the improvements of a modern community. It is likely to become one of the great cities of the West. The city was growing, and as it did, it went back to its roots. Even before the auction that created the town in 1905, developer J.T. McWilliams had created a settlement near the railroad. The area was now called Old Las Vegas. In 1923, the city constructed a new school here, the Las Vegas Grammar School, later known as the West Side School. The next year, Helen Stewart sold land near the school to Dr. Roy Martin and other prominent Las Vegans. With visions of the coming dam dancing in their heads, they created a subdivision. They called their project West Side, and the name would stick. It should become a choice residential section with the growth of Las Vegas. It is a gratifying success. Nearly all the $100 lots have been sold. The Las Vegas Age, April 5, 1924. Alice Doolittle, a dental hygienist, recalled the mid-20s mood in Las Vegas.
Ed Von Tobel used to come up and have his teeth fixed, and he said to me one day, "Mrs. Doolittle, buy some land." I said, "Where?" "Anywhere," he said. "North, east, south, or west, just buy it."
Las Vegas was going to become the hub of a construction site of building this massive dam across the Colorado River. Entrepreneurial spirit exploded in Las Vegas. You got to get this land, you got to get in the ground floor of the Boulder Dam. It's going to be a big deal, you're going to make lots of money.
Helen Stewart was still a believer.
Some rich men are buying up all the land they can, close into Las Vegas. They are paying from $25 to $35, $50, $100, $150, and $200 an acre. They are talking Boulder Canyon Dam, stronger than ever.
Helen Stewart, once the quintessential Las Vegas pioneer, was now called the First Lady of Las Vegas. But after all her years of hope, she would not live to see a dam built near her beloved city. She would die in March 1926, with Congress still locked in debate. Demographically, Las Vegas was still a typical Nevada town. Most residents were white, of European descent. But not all.
This was a more diverse community than we tend to think about.
The African American community was tiny, a group of some 50 people. The original ethnic group was still here. A small band of Southern Paiutes lived on a tiny reservation. Most of them were destitute. Diseases brought in by white people added to their distress.
The largest minority population was from the Asian community, Japanese.
Many Japanese Americans were truck farmers. Bill Tamayasu came to Vegas in 1916, then married a picture bride from Japan whom he never met. Together, they raised a family and worked a farm for over 50 years.
There was a Mexican presence here. You know, there was a black presence here.
One African American was Clarence Ray, who had been brought in to help break the railroad strike in 1922.
In 1925, I just moved back up here to stay. Blacks worked in the railroad shops. They worked as machinists and electricians. Everybody had some kind of job.
Clarence Ray thought the African American community was very robust, very successful, He saw all of the businesses owned by blacks.
Back in the 1920s, blacks and whites in Las Vegas got along fine. We went to everything together. Everyone went to school together. We never had any trouble until later.
Clarence Ray thought that there was harmony among African Americans and whites at the time. I don't know how much of that is really true.
Not everyone in Las Vegas was keen on integration. For decades, America had seen massive immigration. Competition for jobs triggered a national backlash, especially the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. In the 1920s, the group had several million members, or even more.
They were organizing across the country, and one of the places that they came to was Las Vegas.
This is a group that, yes, they're racially biased, obviously, but at the same time, the KKK is targeting religious groups like members of the Catholic Church, Jews. The KKK included 10 Claverns in Nevada.
A lot of the railroad jobs are lost here, and they're taken to Caliente, Nevada. So I think that brings about a lot of tension. Fewer jobs usually brings out the worst in us. And we see that with the Ku Klux Klan marching down Fremont Street in full regalia. Frightening. But the African American community was appalled. And the white community here in Las Vegas promised that the Ku Klux Klan would not become a part of this community.
Life in Las Vegas in the mid-20s was magic. 1923 saw the beginning of a significant change in the community of Las Vegas, and that was because of technology.
One of the trailblazers was Bob Griffith. He had moved to Las Vegas as a kid in 1905. Late in life, he would say, "I was lucky. As a boy, I came to Las Vegas when the town was new. It raised me, and I tried to raise it."
Bob Griffith, in 1925, he applied to be the postmaster and he got the job.
Griffith soon made a very basic change in the system.
Home delivery of mail. That's one of those things we just don't, we take it so much for granted, we don't even think about it. That's just, of course you get it at home. That's why you've got a slot in the door. That's why we have numbers on our houses. You didn't normally get that in the early days. You always had to go to the post office.
And oh my goodness, somebody is coming to the door. This is exciting. What am I going to get?
It says something about a city. You've grown up. You know, you're not just a dusty little burg out in the middle of nowhere anymore.
In 1926, another vital innovation was sweeping across America: airmail. The post office wanted to link Los Angeles and Salt Lake City with a route that would stop in Las Vegas if the city could provide a suitable airfield. In theory, Las Vegas did have an airport.
But the airport wasn't anything. So Bob Griffith got involved and said, you know, that's great, fine and dandy, we got this airport, but you can't land there because you've got tumbleweeds growing in the runway. And he actually ended up scraping the runways and flattening them out and getting the Boy Scouts involved to pick up broken glass and bottles littering the runways, making it a functioning airport. In April of 1926, Western Air Express flies into Las Vegas for the first time.
Think of it in the 20s. This is brand new. It isn't, you've seen one plane, you've seen them all. I finally saw a plane. This is big. And there's the mail, and let's distribute.
A letter from your friend that could have been put in the mail early in the morning, and you would get that letter late in the afternoon. That was very special.
People come down there to see the plane arrive.
Las Vegas Review wrote, the value of airmail to Las Vegas cannot be overestimated. Las Vegas will be the only regular stop on the new commercial airway, which will place us definitely on the air map of the country. Suddenly, all kinds of important people might drop in for a visit to Las Vegas. Even the great star of radio, Will Rogers, might turn up. Or over.
And his plane landed in Las Vegas and literally flipped over. He hung there in his safety harness for 15 or 20 minutes until somebody was able to unhook him.
We have an airline stop. What comes next?
Las Vegas began to sort of wake up and say, well, wait a minute. We can plug ourselves into the world outside. There's always something new coming down the pike. And so we've got to get our hands on it, and we've got to promote it and see what we can do to make it work for us.
Las Vegans begin to think of the possibilities of being a tourist town. And Lorenzi's part of that. David Lorenzi was a French immigrant, and he dug out a couple of lakes. They became Twin Lakes, and what is now Lorenzi Park is where his resort was located.
Lorenzi's resort, it was a great big spring, and they turned it into a place where you could go and swim and sit under the trees. It was a little bit out of town at the time, so it was like a little jaunt. You could take a horse, you could take your buggy, you could drive your flivver, through the sand out there.
Twin Lakes staged beauty pageants, dance contests, prize fights, horse races. Admission, one thin dime.
You might have up to 1,000 people showing up there for a big community event. And there was a restaurant, and there was dancing, and there were bands playing. It's a resort, and you can visit, and you can be a tourist there.
In the mid-20s, a man named J.W. Woodard had created special accommodations for tourists to Las Vegas.
J.W. Woodard was really an entrepreneur. He was one of the first, if not the first, automobile dealerships in Las Vegas. He also saw the future. There was this new sort of traveler, not on the train. They now had cars. And with cars, they needed garages, and they needed places to stay. He had cabins, he had a garage, he had a grocery store that had sandwiches. The rooms that have showers, the cars, you could drive a car so it was covered from the sun or the cold or the wind or the rain. Woodard was really the first motel guy in Las Vegas.
The first motel signaled the arrival of tourists in southern Nevada. And one day in early 1926, a 50-piece band paraded through town, followed by no less than 300 men, all carrying rifles. They had come for a trap shooting event, and they were more than welcome. The Las Vegas Age wrote that this is one of the largest delegations ever to visit Las Vegas, so it is necessary for the credit of the city that everything possible be done to make the stay of the visitors pleasant.
They were modernizing the city, and they were setting up hospitals and the police, and all kinds of things like that were going on. They began to pave the streets. Enough people had moved into town that when you picked up the phone to talk to somebody, you could no longer give just their name. Hello? You had to give their number because there were so many people coming into town.
The center of Las Vegas even began to light up with a special glow: neon. The flashy element would soon change the look of Las Vegas and become a stylistic trademark. The first neon sign was the word hotel at the Overland. Immediately, the battle for bigger and brighter began. And neon flashed all over Fremont Street. At the Overland, the Boulder Club, the Northern Club. In some of those places, under new neon signs, you could still get a drink. In the mid-20s, Las Vegas gambling clubs were still managing to ignore prohibition. There were no roulette wheels, but card games were plentiful and legal. William German was the mayor.
He campaigned in 1923 on a strict, hard-nosed policy of he was going to find a way to enforce prohibition, and in essence, he was going to end gambling.
But German's efforts to clean up the city were consistently blocked by the city commission. And then the laws changed. And this would change Las Vegas.
So you had two basic laws. You had the federal law and you had the state law. Then in 1923, the Nevada government said, no, we're abolishing the prohibition laws. There is no state prohibition.
No. We don't really want prohibition, and so they repealed their approval of the 18th Amendment. And that meant that it was entirely up to the feds to police Nevada as far as prohibition went. The local constabulary would not do it. They didn't have to do it.
And the federal government wasn't quite sure how to enforce it.
The Fed offices were based in San Francisco, so by the time they decided to raid a place, it was known for like a week. So there was plenty of time to clean things up, and many times the feds showed up to knock over a still, and there was nothing there.
So Las Vegas was open.
The fact was, you've got guys making booze from Mesquite to, well, anywhere along the Colorado River, basically anywhere that there's water.
Merle Emery ferried people between Arizona and Nevada on his boat.
Whiskey was the deal. These bootleggers had come down to the ferry, pretty well out in the open, hollering it out. Anybody on the other side? So you'd haul a man across with his load of whiskey.
There were even businessmen in Las Vegas who were bootlegging on the side.
There were stills all over the place here. There was a lot of booze here.
And Las Vegas now saw something it had never seen before: a gangster. Jim Ferguson was a walking archetype, a tough guy up to his neck in bootlegging, bribery, and violence. Because of him, a young boy would die on the streets of Las Vegas.
Ferguson is a boss of Las Vegas in ways that politicians were not bosses and other economic factors were not bosses. He is our corrupt criminal boss of the 20s.
A ready target awaited him: the Arizona Club in Block 16.
He came down to Las Vegas, and what he found was that Block 16 was pretty much in the hands of the same people who'd been running it for well over a decade. And this is an opportunity.
In 1925, Ferguson invaded with his gang the Arizona Club. He and his gang one night beat everybody up. They had a big brawl.
And Ferguson muscles in.
Ferguson is now in charge of the underworld. And he starts deciding who is going to be selling whiskey and running prostitution. They're going to have to pay him a fee. And so he controlled everything.
That same year, Mayor German again campaigned on a promise to clean up the city. It wouldn't be easy. The city had a police chief and 2 or 3 policemen. Even so, the mayor hoped to get rid of bootlegging.
And the mayor said, it's still bad for our community. We're going to tighten it.
These are the laws. We want to obey them. He wants to make sure that Las Vegas is a good and growing community. There is certainly in Las Vegas a contingent of people who feel we should be obeying this law. This is a bad thing to do, to ignore a constitutional amendment and a congressional enactment. But try to legislate morality. It doesn't always work. In 25, when German runs for re-election, his opponent is Fred Hess. And Hess's attitude toward prohibition is more hands-off.
Fred Hess.
Much is being said about the morals of our city. If I'm elected, there'll be no lifting of the lid. The future of Las Vegas lies in the observance of decency and sanity.
Decency, but a dose of sanity. The folks on the north side of the street, the Block 16, they knew what sanity meant. We're going to have some live and let live rules in here. And he won.
For the first time, a city mayor would serve a term of 4 years. But could Fred Hess actually get something done?
When Hess took over as mayor of Las Vegas in 1925, city government was bankrupt. Streets were not being paved. The fire and police department was in the red. He decided to fix that. Well, they started to institute stiff fines.
Ferguson, he ends up working out a system, a protection racket, where he works with members of the city police department.
They would bust people on a regular basis. You knew you were going to get busted. You're going to come in and pay your $300 fine and go back to your business and do whatever you needed to do. You're good for a couple of months.
That was a tremendous moneymaker for Las Vegas.
City government really liked this idea that they were getting revenue from the bootleggers. Streets got paved. The city's accounting books were in much better shape.
The city is paving streets, improving the sewer lines, all these other things. What's paying for them is fees they're getting from people who have businesses that do this or are paying fines for being caught doing the things the city's letting them do.
But in the late 1920s, that system would change. Federal agents would be coming to Las Vegas, and they would make big problems for Big Jim Ferguson. In 1928, the El Portal Theater opened on Fremont Street, a beautiful Spanish-style venue that could hold over 700 people.
Their premiere film was Ladies of the Mob, which is so interesting that that's the movie that they picked in 1929. Little did they know, a couple of decades later, it would have a little bit more meaning.
The movie starred Clara Bow. Now, Clara Bow was known as the It Girl. And she epitomized the 1920s flapper, the young woman who would dress a little more provocatively, didn't necessarily want to get married. She ends up in one of the first major celebrity marriages in Las Vegas to a cowboy actor named Rex Bell. They end up, in years to come, getting their own ranch southeast of town. The It Girl, that's the first film at the El Portal. You're seeing the changes that are going on in Hollywood, you're seeing the changes in society, but you're also seeing the changes in Las Vegas. And sure enough, Clara Bow is going to be part of our life here.
This was the era that marked the beginning of a lasting connection, Las Vegas and glamour. In 1929, Hollywood stars John Gilbert and Ina Claire decided to marry here.
They didn't want to wait the 3 days it was required in California, so they came to Las Vegas, a secret visit to Las Vegas. That turned out it wasn't that all that secret. The marriage was a major international story. She wound up a couple of months later on the cover of Time magazine, and it also mentioned that they were married in Las Vegas. For Las Vegas, it was another notch in its belt to become the place where famous stars, famous people came to get married and or divorced.
That same year, films began coming to the El Portal that could do something they never done before.
I hope you like these flowers, Michael Jeffrey.
They talked. Now, with sound, motion pictures, and radios, the world could talk to Las Vegas. And Las Vegas could even talk to the world. The first long-distance phone call between Las Vegas and the outside world connected the San Francisco and Las Vegas Chambers of Commerce. San Francisco told Las Vegas,
"The eyes of the world are upon you, and you are to be congratulated upon the inauguration of this important link. the absence of which has heretofore isolated an important city.
We're now part of the world.
And Las Vegas in 1929 suddenly has a daily newspaper. That's a sign in the late 20s, Las Vegas is headed places.
It was radios, it was long-distance telephone calls, it was daily airmails, it was delivery to your door, and it was talkies.
Aviation, automobiles, we have movies coming here, we've got movies being made here.
Every day you would read the newspaper and something new was going on. It was a magic time.
We're seeing ourselves not as pioneers anymore. We are not a little dirty, dusty desert town anymore. This is a growing city. This is a place that people have set down roots. This is their home. This is their city.
Yes, the on-again, off-again dam project was now on again. In 1928, the Boulder Canyon Project bill finally came before Congress. However, the proposed dam site was not, in fact, in Boulder Canyon.
Bureau of Reclamation looks at locations, and they pick one in Black Canyon. But because they called it Boulder Canyon Project Act, it would be considered Boulder Dam.
Las Vegas held its collective breath as Arizona's two senators began to filibuster the measure. A melee broke out on the Senate floor, with fists cocked and tempers raging. Then the Senate adjourned for the summer. Another delay. Finally, in December 1928, the Senate passed the measure. But even now, nothing was sure. The danger to the Boulder Canyon bill is the White House, the New York Times wrote. Would Coolidge sign it? It didn't seem likely. Calvin Coolidge.
I am a good deal disturbed by the number of proposals that are being made for an expenditure of money, the Boulder Dam bill. I think the lowest estimates on that are $125 million. I don't know just what will happen to the Treasury. As private enterprise can very well fill this field, there is no need for the government to go into it.
But just 3 weeks later, without explanation, Calvin Coolidge signed it.
President Coolidge signed the Boulder Canyon Project into law on December 21st, 1928. And Las Vegas absolutely busted out. They had bands playing. They had a parade that went down Fremont Street. There's lots of photographs of it. All of them with their horns and their drums, and they were pounding, and everybody just celebrated.
People in Las Vegas would always remember the day. Leon Rockwell.
We got the fire truck out, and my God, everybody that could hooked onto it, in carts and baby buggies and everything else, just like they was nuts. There was people that got lit that had never taken a drink before.
Dean Pulsiver.
Everybody in Las Vegas was out celebrating until the wee hours of the morning, and I was one of them. I was out there celebrating until I had to go to work. That was the making of Las Vegas. That made the West here.
Now we know that there is going to be a dam constructed right here in the area.
That is what Southern Nevadans are excited about. There's money to be made in this. There are people who are going to come in here and spend money, and there's going to be some action in Las Vegas.
Land values soared, population jumped, and construction skyrocketed. Sleepy real estate offices suddenly became madhouses.
Everybody's got their own dreams. Everybody's got their own ideas of how this is going to affect the community. It was going to become something huge.
The dam would be a colossus, twice as tall as any other dam on Earth. It would take years to build. Its reservoir would inundate 227 square miles of valley. Its funding came from one of the largest single appropriations bills Congress had ever enacted. For the first time in history, a major player in the development of Las Vegas had suddenly stepped onto the scene: the federal government. But a few months later, the mayor of Las Vegas and its police chief were not celebrating. Until 1928, Jim Ferguson's system of kickbacks still worked perfectly.
City government really liked this idea that they were getting revenue from the bootleggers. Now, the money wasn't going into the mayor's pocket. The money wasn't going into the police chief's pocket. It was going to fund city government. So bootleggers, they could have their stills and come in town and sell alcohol, but they had to give Ferguson some money. If you didn't pay Ferguson the fee, you would get busted all the time.
One of the bootleggers who was supposed to pay protection was a guy named Charlie Bradshaw.
You stopped paying Ferguson. And Bradshaw started to get arrested on a regular basis, more often than any of the other bootleggers in town. And that changed everything. Charlie Bradshaw is making a regular delivery with his wife. Son's in the back seat. He's driving, it's a dirt road. Police chief Spud Lake spots Bradshaw, starts chasing him. The special deputy gets out on the running board of the car and fires 3 shots at the tires of the car. The car bumps, guy still takes a shot, and it goes into the back window of the car. It was at that moment that Bradshaw's 8-year-old son looks out to see what's going on, and the bullet hits him straight in the head, kills him. The police chief, Spud Lake, and his deputy were both charged with murder, with manslaughter. But the jury found them not guilty because they weren't quite sure about the shot, where it had come from, how it had occurred. And more importantly, they felt it was Charlie Bradshaw's fault that his son had died because he had taken his family out on the delivery of bootleg whiskey.
But Bradshaw would have his revenge.
Bradshaw said, Ferguson's the bad guy here. And I'm gonna tell you what, you go into his house, you go into his basement, and you are gonna find everything. Again, across the street from the Arizona Club, they found hundreds of gallons of whiskey.
The feds busted Ferguson. Within months, they also arrested Mayor Fred Hess and Spud Lake for conspiracy to violate the Volstead Act. The trials both took place in 1929.
Federal court, a judge said, there's not enough evidence to hold the mayor, not enough evidence to hold the police chief, let them go.
They get off, but Ferguson will end up going to prison.
Found guilty of all the charges of violating the federal prohibition laws and was sent to jail.
He will come back and try to take over again, doesn't really succeed, eventually disappears from the scene. But what we're seeing here is kind of, you think of Capone and company in Chicago and the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. This is the miniaturized Las Vegas version of these things. And the community is well aware of what's going on. It's a form of organized crime. And he's an organized crime boss.
No one knows when Jim Ferguson died. His death was never mentioned in the newspapers of the city where he had been the king of the bootleggers. Like no other year in the history of Las Vegas, 1929 would completely transform the small city in the desert. The coming dam had people dreaming big.
People moved to Las Vegas by the hundreds and quickly by the thousands, looking for jobs, looking for opportunities. And the town was wide open.
Of course, then the big question was, where are you going to put the workers? How much of the money are we going to be able to get into Las Vegas?
Maybe the city would be the headquarters of the project. Thousands of workers would swarm in. Housing would boom.
As soon as the word comes that this is going to happen, people start showing up here for jobs.
Secretary of the Interior, Ray Lyman Wilbur, came out to do a reconnoiter. And they were going to size up Las Vegas, and they were going to go out to the dam site and have a look around, and then they were going to decide what they were going to do. Las Vegas wanted to polish its shoes and wash its face and make as good an impression as they could. They built a great big welcome arch over Fremont Street that you could see as soon as you came out of the railroad station.
Las Vegas went to great measures to secure Secretary Wilbur's good opinion.
You know, that was the first time we actually got around to closing up all the bars on Block 16.
The government would build a whole new town for the construction workers. Boulder City, it would be called. Very likely, Wilbur's decision came from simple geography. Las Vegas was just too far away from the dam in Black Canyon. It may have been another disappointment for the city, but in 1929, there was no stopping Las Vegas.
That October, we have the crash in New York, and this is considered the onset of the Great Depression. In Las Vegas, they know that construction of the dam is coming. There are discussions going on about reducing the residency requirement for divorce, about allowing casino gambling, and Las Vegas is getting ready to boom.
There would be no depression in Las Vegas. On the contrary.
You had businesses opening right and left all through the late 1920s and early 1930s.
On New Year's Day of 1930, the Las Vegas Review-Journal wrote, "We believe that Las Vegas today stands on the very threshold of unparalleled development. She is to emerge the metropolis of the state of Nevada." That same year, Secretary Wilbur would return. As newsreel cameras whirled, he would drive a silver spike into the railroad tracks. The act signified the completion of a rail line to the future site of Boulder City. But what the ceremony was really doing was celebrating another kind of connection, the one between Las Vegas and the future. After years of dashed expectations, big dreams had come true.
Everybody's thinking about the dam. You know, this is what they're thinking about. This is going to transform Las Vegas. This was going to come in and was going to transform this city into, we didn't know what, but we knew it was going to transform the city.
Las Vegas was growing, and it would continue to grow. Just 25 years after a railroad company auctioned off lots of dust and sand in the desert, a city had developed, survived, and thrived.
These original pioneers who came out to establish Las Vegas as this outpost, this ranch in the middle of one of the hottest, most inhospitable deserts in the country, did what they did, which then allowed the next generation to come up and turn Las Vegas into a real live city.
The small town, long dependent on the railroad, needed to find another way to survive. By 1930, it had found one. The Hoover Dam was coming. With it would come a city that no one in the world could possibly imagine. Las Vegas had suddenly become a 24 hours a day boom town. And it was a boom that would never quite end.